decarbonising agriculture is an interesting term which we're about to discuss now. So things like solar farms, wind turbines and new transmission lines across agricultural landscapes are a visible and sometimes controversial image in Australia's renewable energy transition. But of course there's more to decarbonising agriculture than meets the eye. So as we just saw, if you think bioenergy production from, say, waste streams, hydrogen to ammonia, on-farm energy supply chains, things that, I guess, supply autonomy and the new technology to help measure emissions is also another fascinating one. So the key to this bigger picture is innovation, of course, and in this session we'll explore the challenges and opportunities ahead for the ag industry, where we all aim to reduce our environmental impact. And to do that, I'd like to welcome Natalie Collard to the stage. And Natalie is the CEO of Farmers for Climate Action. So please, big hand for Natalie.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know about you, but I'm pumped up after Stephen's presentation. It was just brilliant. Thank you. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, the people of the Wiradjuri Nation. I pay my respects to you, Auntie Cheryl, and elders past and present, and any First Nations people here today. Thank you for your stewardship of this land for over thousands of years. Farmers in particular admire, respect, and learn from you every day. Thank you for the warm welcome today. It's absolutely brilliant to see so many people together committed to the future of agriculture, working on the knowledge, systems and innovations that aim to solve some of our most pressing challenges. Today, I want to talk about an essential question for Australian agriculture. What does a decarbonised ag sector look like, and how do we get there in a way that strengthens our farms, our communities, and our food systems? So you're going to indulge me just a moment, right? I love a sunburnt country where net zero's in our sights. Electric bikes roam paddocks. Solar storage fuels the night. With tractors charged by sunshine, panels on sheds all aglow. Nature is loud, machinery quiet. Towards the future we shall go. I think we can all agree Dorothea McCullough did it far better than I. So I'll step back from poetry and I remind myself that the farmers in our network that have achieved carbon neutrality already, they tell me that they didn't start with a grand vision of the endpoint. Instead, they looked at a step-by-step approach, what they call the 1%ers, across their whole farm business. An open-minded and analytic approach simply to making their farm business better. As CEO of Farmers for Climate Action, I represent over 8,300 farmer members nationwide. Our story began in 2015, where 30 trailblazing farmers met to discuss the climate challenges they were seeing firsthand, somewhat frustrated by what they felt was a lack of climate leadership from agri-political leaders. These 30 farmers felt a powerful sense of responsibility, not just for the future of their own farms, but for the future of all of Australian agriculture. As you can imagine, our founding 30, as I like to call them, are thrilled by the remarkable progress we've made over nearly a decade. What began as a small, committed group has now grown into a movement, reflecting what I think is the majority, but often silent view, of Australian farmers today. More and more farmers are recognising that taking climate action isn't just responsible, it's simply good business. And today, in addition to our farmer members, we have over 80,000 community supporters drawn from both the city and the country. These Australians stand alongside farmers, recognising the essential role they play in not only feeding and clothing the country and the world, but also in building climate resilience and leading sustainable practices. FCA takes pride in bringing farmers and communities together to champion climate solutions, increase resilience, and create opportunities for our collective future. I'm going to invite you to head to our website and join Click Us, follow the prompts and stand up and be counted with a free farmer or community supporter membership if you feel so inclined. So why do we need climate action? Today's farmers are facing some of the most extreme and unpredictable climate conditions Australia has ever seen. It costs farmers on average, and this is really old data, $30,000 per farm every year just to deal with extreme weather. The Bureau of Meteorology tells us that the frequency of extreme fire days has surged tenfold since the 1960s. In the 2010s, we recorded 143 extreme fire days, compared to just 14 in the 1960s. This isn't a future issue, it's here, affecting the lives and livelihoods of farmers right now. What does it mean? What does it look like? It looks like fire, drought, flood, rising temperatures, each of which is placing an increasing strain on farm productivity, mental health, and business viability. Farmers bear the brunt of climate impacts, and we can't afford to overlook the toll that it takes. Rising costs, particularly insurance and energy costs, pose a substantial burden on each and every farm business. At the same time, farmers are being asked to play a role in reducing emissions. However, with limited tools and new reporting requirements, such as Scope 3 emissions reporting, it is clear that farmers need time, resources, and trusted expertise, all of which are often in short supply. So, while we know agriculture contributes to emissions, it's critical to recognise that the primary sources of methane in Australia are not from farmers, but from the coal and gas sectors. For years, the finger has been pointed at agriculture, but with recent insights from organisations like Open Methane, we're more aware of Australia's actual emissions profile. We can decarbonise agriculture, but simplistic solutions that harm profitability and productivity won't be the answer. Farmers are already stepping up. Some of the stats here will really encourage you, I hope. And farmers deserve tailored, supportive policies that reflect their reality and their ability and willingness to be part of the solution. Our mission at FCA aligns with the national goal of reaching net zero, but it's essential to understand what that means. Net zero is about balancing greenhouse gases emitted with the amount removed from the atmosphere. It's essentially about achieving a sustainable equilibrium. In agriculture, we're seeing exciting innovations leading us down this path every day. For example, clean energy is creating double income streams for farmers. Some are receiving more than $40,000 per wind turbine annually, and you can host around 20 on a farm, and up to $1,500 per hectare for hosting solar panels, while still maintaining productive land use. This double income, if you will, means we're able to farm and produce clean energy, improving both our balance sheets and our energy security as a nation. Additionally, practices like solar grazing are making a real impact. Wool growers Tony Inder from Wellington, Tom Warren in Dubbo, report that sheep grazing under solar panels is producing higher quality wool, further benefiting their farm's productivity and profitability. Again, this double benefit approach is gaining popularity as farmers seek out more practical and profitable ways to contribute to Australia's climate goals. One farmer keen to share his message with us today is Andrew O'Day from the Darling Downs.
It has been 12 years since we had to pay an electricity bill. So the solar income would be around 30% of our farm revenue. My family have been on this same property for nearly 150 years. I'm the 5th generation. I love it, and my kids, they might be the 6th. It's up to them, I guess. And my dad's life on the farm was really tough. Drought always seems to rise its head every now and again, and you think of it as the hardest one we've ever gone through, and then something else comes along. And we've got beef, sheep, same as he did, and now solar. Without it, we would struggle through a drought, basically. Our solar panels are on 2 sheds. You can never have too many sheds, no, I find. I would highly recommend solars or renewables for any farm. This investment has been a real blessing.
Thanks, Andrew. Despite these gains in reducing emissions economy-wide, the on-farm journey to net zero in agriculture continues. And I note again, we don't need full decarbonisation. We don't need to be at zero emissions, just net zero. But to do that, we're still going to need collaboration and support. And here's what I think we need to get there effectively. Trusted information and investment in research and extension. Farmers need access to reliable, evidence-based data and resources. Programs like Victoria's recent Agriculture and Energy Investment Program, which I had the privilege of working on, start with customised energy audits at a farm level to identify the best options for each farm's unique needs. We need models like this ramped up and scaled across the country, along with continued investment in research such as the Net Zero Emissions CRC, which we're a proud partner of, the great work of Food Agility and CSU and others, and we'd love to see investment in agri-solar extended as well. Without a doubt, extension is the missing link that needs to be prioritised and ramped up for the shift to net zero. Secondly, incentives for renewable energy. Incentives that help farmers shift from diesel to renewable sources plus storage will reduce both the costs of this technology quickly, but also immediately reduce emissions on farm. High upfront costs of on-farm renewables are still a great barrier, so policies that support access alongside investment in the existing grid and fair transmission planning will help. With the right government support, we can make clean energy accessible to more farms, creating a win-win for our farmers, the environment and the economy. It's essential that we recognise the often unseen link between a lack of policy attention on the traditional grid and upgrading it, and support for on-farm, behind-the-meter renewables. The concerning pushback against new large-scale renewable projects in regional Australia is linked to the fact that their energy needs at a household and farm level are often being left behind. Imagine being reliant on a single-wire earth return or single-phase power line that barely meets your household energy needs, let alone a farm. Now imagine you've been calling for an upgrade alongside your fellow community members and councils for over a decade, only to be ignored. Would you welcome brand new poles and wires that you can't even access? Roads that you can't access for over a year, simply because it's collective for the greater good, but it's not helping anyone in that regional community access clean energy or even have energy equity. This is the reality for many farmers committed to climate action. They're forced to fork out on diesel generators that they don't personally believe in and which send them backwards financially and environmentally, makes them a little nervous to know their carbon number. Despite this, over 71% of farmers have already invested their own cash into measures that do reduce emissions. If they've invested in on-farm renewables, did you know that if their house is on a separate title, it's actually illegal to use the energy that they've invested to generate and store to offset their household power bills? Updating outdated policy settings like these is one budget-neutral way we can incentivise on-farm decarbonisation today. Thirdly, social licence and community buy-in. Polling shows strong support for renewable energy developments in regional areas, with 70% in favour and around 18% opposed. Those numbers haven't really changed in over a decade. But it's critical that these projects benefit the community. Community co-design and genuine benefit sharing, such as energy bill discounts from developers for all households and businesses in that postcode. And currently these are being offered by 3 developers at the moment nationwide, and the smallest offset is $250 per bill, discounted. Makes a big difference. The largest is $1,000. And community benefit sharing, such as we're seeing with Winterbourne Wind in New England. The value of that project from a community benefit sharing perspective is a fund of over $30 million for the life of the wind farm, indexed to CPI. And to put that in perspective, what it means for this community, 90% of that development is in the council area of Walker. Walker has a population of just over 3,000 people, which is 1,000 households or businesses, and they will share in 90% of that $30 million. That's going to completely change that regional prosperity, livelihoods, well-being, aged care, education, health, everything. So win-wins like this are what we're after. These measures are urgently needed to build trust and increase acceptance of new large-scale renewable projects. Government mandates for a minimum standard for community shared benefits can help renewables support both farmers and their communities. Take a moment and just imagine the prosperity and dynamism of regional Australia if we can secure standards like this across the board. It excites me, it truly does. Fourthly, recognition of agriculture's broader environmental impact. Ag is essential not just for emissions reduction, but also for land and nature conservation. Australian farmers manage 55% of the nation's landmass. We're at the forefront of regenerative practices that enhance biodiversity and strengthen ecosystem resilience. Recognising and rewarding these efforts through targeted government incentives and policies will drive broader adoption and amplify our positive impact. Decarbonisation alone should not be our aim. Our focus must be on ensuring that land remains productive, is sustainably managed for the long term. There's a growing need for policies that balance carbon goals with productive land use, appropriately valuing nature within active ag landscapes to support both environmental health and ag prosperity. We're here to have those discussions and land what the right policy mix might be with decision makers. As we work towards these goals, Farmers for Climate Action continues to engage with government, industry and communities, advocating for the needs of farmers and promoting climate-smart practices. We've seen bipartisan support for policies like rooftop solar and energy storage. We'd love these applied explicitly to agriculture. FCA will advocate for policies that prioritise productivity, profitability and resilience of our primary producers. A net zero ag sector, if supported appropriately, strengthens Australia's food security, bolsters regional economies and positions Australia as a leader in sustainable food production globally. I think it's what we agree we all deserve. We know achieving net zero in ag won't be simple, but by pursuing net zero and prosperity together, we'll be ensuring a future that supports rural Australians, nurtures our natural environment, and provides food and fibre for a growing population. And I'm convinced that together we can lead agriculture to this prosperous, environmentally secure future. In closing, I urge you all, we're in an incredible room today, researchers, policymakers, industry leaders and farmers, to join us in supporting Australia's agriculture transition to net zero. It's going to take true collaboration, it's going to take time and conversations, but it's a tremendous opportunity and well worth doing. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much, Natalie Collard, and you can tell from that Natalie's a wonderful, advocate for renewable energy and rural communities across Australia, so terrific work, thank you. No time for questions, I'm afraid, from Natalie, but as we said earlier, if you've got any burning questions, put them on Slido and use the code, of course, DAS24. So we've had the big picture. Now we'll go a bit in depth and look at a case study. And it's our pleasure to have from New Zealand, Mike Casey from Rewiring NZ. He's the chief executive of Rewiring Aotearoa, a New Zealand charity dedicated to electrifying millions of fossil fuel machines in New Zealand as fast as possible. And Mike believes that he's created the world's first fully electric farm that's powered through New Zealand's national grid. And this is on his own on-farm renewable system. Mike's here to discuss, though, capital and operational costs, payback, and tell the story of how he made it all happen and why he's never going back to conventional power. So please, a big warm welcome to Mike.
Thank you, Tim. All right, well, you Aussies are about to learn a very serious lesson, which is you never give a Kiwi a microphone in front of a captive Australian audience. I have been given 20 minutes to talk, and I plan to absolutely ruin morning tea. In the spirit of the Anzacs, go well over time. My name is Mike. Kia ora. I am from New Zealand. I'm from the deep south of Central Otago. Many people in New Zealand know me as the electric cherry orchardist, mainly because I can't stop talking about myself and my farm. I grew up in Wellington, but right after finishing university with a degree in computer science, I moved to Sydney. I'll be very grateful for this country because I spent 12 years in Sydney building a technology startup, a website for university students here in Australia that were looking for their first job. And in 2019, about 4 out of 5 university students in Australia used it to find their first job, and it was acquired by Seek. And that gave my wife, Rebecca, and I enough capital to do something that we'd wanted to do for a little while, which is move back to New Zealand and move closer to home, right? But I had never, ever stepped foot on a farm before in my life. What I was looking for, what Rebecca was looking for, was a 4-bedroom home in Queenstown, New Zealand. It's a really, really nice place if you've been there before. And what we actually found was a 9-hectare farm, right? 1 hour north of Queenstown, for the same price as a 4-bedroom home in Queenstown. It was running sheep at the time, but what anyone in Central Otago, New Zealand does with spare land is we decide to plant fruit trees, right? Lots and lots of fruit trees. We have 9,300 fruit trees, or cherry trees, which is about 25 kilometres of cherry trees. And I thought my next job, my next role, my next startup was going to be something in the climate space. And I thought originally, wouldn't it be great if I could plant some trees, because surely they go about sequestering a large amount of carbon. What they do is they produce about 80 tonnes of cherries at full production. This will be our first full production year this year, which is about 10 million cherries in total. So we're a really large commercial operation. But I got the scientists in to actually look at how much carbon we actually sequestered from our 9,300 cherry trees, and the answer was 3.8 tonne per year on a 25 linear model, which in New Zealand we say is bugger all, right? The problem that we actually have is that in order to run a productive cherry orchard in New Zealand, we would need to consume or produce or emit about 50 tonnes of emissions burning diesel. Now, I was in this really advantageous position where I had a lot of capital and I had a blank canvas, and I thought to myself, well, what if we could do things differently? What if we could start to look at sourcing electric machines from all over the world, bring them to our farm, run a really high-grade commercial operation, a really profitable operation, and sort of prove to the world that electric technology is the way forward in the future. Fast forward 5 years, 21 electric machines across our farm and our home, right? Which has been an absolute amazing journey to go on. I've been from everywhere from South Africa all the way to San Francisco to source technology from around the world, put it all together, and the amazing thing is that we managed to get a complete payback of only 13 years on machines that we expect to last between 15 and 20 years. In fact, every time I did the numbers now on my orchard machines, it always ended up that the lifetime cost of the electric machine was cheaper than that of the diesel one. And what was even greater was that even when I financed it on my mortgage, right, paying the finance cost was cheaper than continuing to pay the fossil fuel cost, even though the capital cost of the electric machine was greater. So within 5 years, I actually produced what I think, no one has challenged me on this yet, the world's first fully electric farm. Right, and since you guys have, there may be some people in the room that have been to my farm, but there were a couple of people over in Perth that when I was presenting a couple of months ago that had indeed been to my farm. We have had a lot of Australians come over, but since most of you will not have been to my farm, I thought what I'd do is I'd run through the calculations on a couple of the big machines that we have, just to show you how this stacks up. Now, it's really important. Like, I'm a firm believer that transparency breeds trust, and we've had probably in the vicinity of 12 to 15,000 farmers come to our farm in the last 3 years to learn all about the electrification of farming, what I've done, and to look at the example that I've created. So I give them all sorts of numbers on every machine, right? Because it's really important that we provide this. We don't try and cloak this and say, oh, it's better for the environment. We don't try to virtue signal it. We simply show them the numbers, right? I don't know about farmers here in Australia, but farmers in New Zealand, they don't necessarily align with the green, but they love the green. And one of the big things here is just the sheer amount of money that we save on these machines. So this, for example, is our electric frost fighting fans. They are the first electric frost fighting fans in New Zealand. They came all the way from South Africa. Basically what a frost fighting fan does, for those of you that don't know, is they pull the warm air down from above, mix it around the orchard, and bring the average temperature of the orchard up. Really important for fruit growing, because if it gets too cold, our fruit dies, and then we don't get any income. We don't get any income, the bank starts knocking, right? Case in point, during the middle of COVID, I was looking to try and figure out how to convert a couple of old clunky diesel fans to electric. A diesel frost fighting fan will burn between 30 to 40 litres of diesel an hour, and in our region we will fight frost for about 200 hours in the year. So you can see that it stacks up really, really quickly. I found a website in South Africa. I ended up buying these fans sight unseen in the middle of COVID and figuring out how to install them myself, which was quite a journey for someone who's classically trained in computer science. But we got the job done, and we've got a market payback on these machines of just under 4 years. All right. When farmers come to my farm, they always talk about how electric vehicles are great for the city, but they're not great for people in the country. I have to tell them they couldn't be further from the truth. Literally, the more Ks you drive, the better you are off in an electric vehicle, right? I live 15 kilometres out of town. The local town that I'm in is Carnovale. That means for the school trips, we drive about 60 kilometres a day, right? Stacks up really, really quickly. In our particular case, we bought cars in 2020 when they were really, really expensive, and the market payback on that was still 8 years, right? So an incredible, with the government grant that we got for those, we got them down to about 6 years, and of course the prices on electric vehicles have now plummeted, and we're starting in New Zealand to see a real increase in the amount of electric vehicles on farm, or when I say on farm, owned by farmers, but mainly for road use. This is New Zealand's first commercial electric tractor. I had to fly over to San Francisco, and convince the board of a billion-dollar tech startup that I was their ideal customer in the complete wrong location in the world. They actually ended up sending me their 66th ever made tractor in America, the first ever to leave California, and it came over to Carnovale. Again, the numbers, it's really interesting. This is a 55 brake horsepower tractor that can do anything a 90 horsepower diesel tractor can do. Right, so pretty remarkable in that regard. The cost is very, very similar. What we needed to do, though, is make sure that we could run this tractor for the full length of time that we needed. It takes about 10 hours to spray our orchard. Well, this is a foliage sprayer that sits on the back of the tractor and basically sprays whatever foliage, nutrients, fungicides, pesticides, whatever we require at the time. One of the big issues with traditional sprayers is they run off the back of the PTO and they use a huge amount of energy. In fact, when we put a traditional sprayer on the back of this tractor, we could get about 3 hours of runtime out of it before we needed to charge it. It takes about 4 hours to charge. You get the idea it wasn't particularly efficient. By building a sprayer that runs off a 32 amp caravan plug out the back of the tractor, we can do the same job for about 15% of the energy, meaning that we can easily now spray our orchard for that full 10-hour period. And one of the great things about that is that it's been so successful, the company that we partnered with to build these has now actually gone one step further and created a couple more that are now running on vineyards in the Napa Valley, which is super exciting. And so again, if you have a look at the figures here, this bleeding edge technology, it's about 15 years, mainly 15 years, because it's a one-off sprayer build that we had to do all the research and figure out how to do it ourselves. It was not an off-the-shelf product. Plus the fact that we had to pay an extra $25,000 worth of shipping to get a lithium iron phosphate battery in a tractor all the way over from San Francisco to New Zealand. You get the idea, it was quite expensive, but even then we expect this technology to last far longer than that, and with the grants that we got from the government, we actually managed to get that down to be pretty much square with the house, which was super exciting. And in total, if you add it all up, my market payback on everything is about 13 years or about 8 years with the grants, and across the home and the household, we save about 50 tonnes, right? Now, I have released a report very recently on all of this stuff, which is available in a report that we call Electric Homes on the rewiring.nz website. I might bring that up on a slide a bit later on so you guys can scan the code for that. But essentially, what I'm very, very confident in is these numbers. I even managed to enlist the help of a climate scientist, an Australian climate scientist actually, who went through all my numbers, made a few tweaks and made sure it was all accurate and ready to go, because the most important thing that we can provide other farmers in this region or in the southern hemisphere is real world examples of this happening in ways that we actually make money, right? So if you add the home and my farm together, we save about $42,000 a year in energy costs, right? On a farm that is expected in a good season to make about $300,000 to $350,000 of EBIT. So you can see it's an absolute remarkable return for us. If we were to run everything on diesel and gas in the home, we would be spending about $53,000 a year. By electrifying everything and running off New Zealand's national grid, we more than halve our energy bills. And my first solar system, we managed to bring that down by almost half again, so turning 53 grand into about $11,000 worth of bills. But this is where it gets really exciting for farmers. I know there's a lot of battles that need to be fought here in Australia as well. But this year, I turned it into a negative $10,000 bill. All right, how did I do that? I am paid as a farmer to push power back from my batteries, to New Zealand's national grid when everyone needs it, right? By pushing power back to the grid during peak periods, I bring down the long-run marginal cost of the network, and that is valuable to the network. I had to really fight for this, but by fighting for it, we managed to actually get what we believe is the first contract in New Zealand for a farmer to kind of behave like a micro power station. Right? So that combined with the export earnings from the surplus solar that we create, that's a really massive opportunity. I have now in the last couple of months pretty much tripled the size of my solar array and battery array. Why? Because I've made it economical. My wife is a CFO, and if she likes this idea, we know that we're onto a good thing. Right. This is the Electric Farms report here for anyone who wants a copy of it. Also, anyone who wants a copy of these slides, again, transparency is key, so feel free to hit up the organisers of this great event and you can grab my slides. Let's talk about the economics of the New Zealand electricity system. Now, it's very, very similar to the Australian system, but with a couple of small nuances in it, right? We talk about, in both cases, in both countries, we talk about the cost to generate electricity. This is on the right-hand side, right? There's the wholesale rate of electricity. The important thing to understand is that is not what the customers of New Zealand or indeed Australia pay for power. They also have to pay for the delivery cost. That's all the poles and wires that connect their home or their business to the power stations, right? And in New Zealand, that works out now to be around about 34 cents per kilowatt hour. You contrast that to rooftop solar. That's now, if you take the rooftop solar and you spread it over its expected lifetime of 25 years, you're looking at 6.4 cents a kilowatt hour, or about 12 cents a kilowatt hour if you finance it on your mortgage. You Aussies are even luckier because it's about 2.9 cents here in Australia. Quite remarkable. And on my farm, due to the scale, I've managed to get that down to about 3.6 cents or 7 cents when I finance it on my mortgage, right? So essentially that's a remarkable opportunity, because when you combine it with batteries, we are now in this really interesting situation behind the meter where it is now cheaper for me to generate electricity and store it in a battery than it is to buy it from New Zealand's national grid. Isn't that remarkable, right? The same applies here in Australia as well, and so one of the things that we have to be doing in the agriculture sector is fighting for a fair and open energy system that rewards farmers appropriately for the contributions that they can actually make. Another way of looking at this is, even if Peter Dutton came to New Zealand and gave us a free nuclear power plant in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand, it would still not get to the households of New Zealand cheaper than their own rooftop solar, right? So that's a really big and important thing we need to be thinking about. We are going to need both types of generation. We're going to need a lot more centralized generation. We're going to need a lot more distributed generation. But maximizing distributed generation is the cheapest energy system moving forward. Right? Discovering all this myself allowed me to become the CE of Rewiring Aotearoa. Many of you would have heard of Rewiring Australia and Rewiring America, a chap by the name of Dr. Saul Griffith, who is a very well-known Australian in this space. has basically taken me under his wing to try and make me the New Zealand version of him, which is actually really exciting because I'm learning so much about sort of the a more disciplined argument around energy and how it will work, taking my real-world cherry example and applying it with some actual data-driven, evidence-based arguments, and we're coming up with a solution for New Zealand that is going to work really, really well. And so let's talk about that solution quickly. These are two Sankeys. One is the traditional way that we categorize New Zealand's emissions there on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side is the way that we categorize Australia's emissions, right, traditionally. And one of the big problems that we have in New Zealand, of course, is we have such a prominent agriculture industry, it immediately makes farmers look like climate criminals, right? Over half of New Zealand's emissions are agriculture. And one of the things that we are trying to do is reframe this narrative away from these traditional sectors to one that actually makes a lot more sense for New Zealand. And if you do this, right, we can split our emissions into two key categories. The trade emissions, which are the hard emissions for us to talk about because it makes climate look like a cost. It's how New Zealand makes all of its money, right? And our domestic emissions, right? And our domestic emissions are essentially the emissions that underpin the average lifestyle of New Zealand and are ultimately made, the decisions around these emissions are ultimately made by individual New Zealanders. The domestic emissions are the low-hanging cherries of New Zealand's emissions, and if we take these emissions and expand on them, one of the most interesting things is that 25% of all of New Zealand's gross emissions come from small fossil fuel machines where the technology exists to replace them today. And in many of those cases, you will save money by replacing those diesel machines today, right? And so that's what I'm heavily focused on. It's not about solving the whole of the climate crisis for New Zealand, it's about focusing on our low-hanging cherries. This is New Zealand's energy system, another great way of looking at it. We always pat ourselves on the back about how highly renewable our electricity system is, while neglecting to talk about our energy system as pretty much 3/4 fossil fuels, right? That is all of the machines that I've just spoken about. We have to figure out how to do that because at the moment, New Zealanders spend about $40 million a day at the pump. And when you think about it, that is money that just evaporates out of New Zealand's economy and heads back overseas to oil-producing nations, right? So how do you fix the current account of New Zealand? We don't have a particularly strong one in the OECD. Well, one of the clear ways that we can do this is by stopping spending money on foreign energy. And finally, New Zealand has the resources to do it. See, we've always been jealous of you lot because you can just dig stuff out of the ground and sell it overseas. We don't have that luxury. But finally, we have something that's at our disposal. In order for New Zealand to replace all of its diesel machines, it's going to need somewhere between like a 200 to 300% renewable electricity grid, right? Really doubling or potentially even tripling the electricity grid if we're going to think about the new technologies that are coming to New Zealand, namely things like data centers. We have one of the best hydro schemes in the world, which is really exciting. We have fantastic wind resources. We don't have as good solar resources as you, but actually they're still really economical to run huge solar operations in New Zealand. We have 2 million homes in New Zealand where it's now an economic slam dunk to put solar on the roof, and if 80% of those homes did put solar on the roof, we'd generate about 40% more electricity for New Zealand's national grid right there. But our real superpower is our farmers, right? That's 50,000 farms. And if every single one of those farmers did what I did, which is not a huge system, a medium-sized system, we would generate about 60% more renewable electricity for New Zealand's system. But so between the homes and the farms alone, we could double the amount of renewable energy in New Zealand, right? Now think about Australian farmers and how much land resources they have available to do something like that. There is a massive solution on the horizon for Australia through its farmers as well. So, in the spirit of the Anzacs, let's talk about what New Zealand has been fantastic at over the last couple of years. Do you know this is the world's first fully electric home? It is over 150 years old and it was built in Tauranga, New Zealand, right? Defined as fully electric because it had electric resistive water heating and electric resistive space heating, right? Why was this the case? Because we realized really, really early on we didn't have a lot of fossil fuels. We had a great hydro scheme, and it was far cheaper to generate electricity than it was to import it from overseas. Likewise, New Zealand has the world's first ever public electric streetlights, right? in Reefton on the west coast of New Zealand. I know no one's ever heard of that before. We actually beat Paris by a couple of weeks, would you believe it or not? And I'd rather go to Reefton rather than Paris, to be honest, because it's less likely to get pickpocketed. We have the second ever transmission line in the world, the first ever transmission line in the Southern Hemisphere, right? It was built in New Zealand to run an electric stamping battery during the gold mining era. We have the world's first fully electric cherry orchard, which is super exciting. And we have a lot more firsts on the way in the agriculture sector as well. And I think one of the most amazing things would be if we can start to get into a little bit of ANZAC competition around what type of farms we can begin to electrify first. Because I'm going to put the challenge to you now that we're going to beat you to the world's first fully electric dairy farm. We're definitely going to beat you to the world's first electric kiwi fruit. That probably goes without saying. And hopefully, the world's first fully electric vineyard as well, right? Why? Because the technology that we already use is already available in the electric version, and because we're going to save a lot of money by doing so. So, in conclusion, I want to work with you guys. I want to work with my Aussie brother and sisters, and I want to make sure that we can, well, in farming, but also just in our economies in general, electrify everything. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. That's an electrifying performance, but fantastic, Mike. Thank you. Bad pun intended. It's time for a panel discussion, and I'd like to just call up stages four for this one. So introduce Dr. Daniela Carnovale. And Daniela is Greenhouse Gas Business and Research Development Manager at biotech company AgCent, and she holds a PhD and is committed to ensuring that scientific advancements, both meaningful, have real-world impact. Take a seat, Daniela. Now, a recent report by grain growers highlighted the challenges and opportunities for the cropping sector to transition away from diesel. And we're pleased that the organisation's Advocacy and Rural Affairs Manager, Sean Cole, is here. Please come to the stage, Sean, on the panel. Sean's previous executive roles focused on grower advocacy, trading, export, manufacturing and the supply chain. Gemma Purcell's farm at Grongrong, about an hour west of here in Wagga, is the host site of Australia's first large-scale community-owned solar garden, and she's passionate about ensuring the transition to renewables, and she brings a community-wide, which brings community-wide benefit. And Gemma is also the Vice Chair of Murrumbidgee Landcare. And of course, welcome back Natalie Collard, and here's Natalie coming up. Natalie, we've just heard from. And our moderator for this one is Stephen Summerhayes. So please, a big warm welcome, and over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. So thank you, panellists. Thank you for your courage, your authenticity, and your vulnerability. Look, let's cut to the chase. Decarbonising ag. Implicit in that title is an imperative. In fact, His Majesty the King last week averred to the fact that we hold humanity in our hands. But last week, Rabobank put out a publication saying, look, oil and grains, 30% increase in New South Wales over winter. Sean, are we overemphasising? Are we alarmist? Or, pardon the dad joke, is it a no-brainer?
Thanks, Steve. And I'm a dad, so I love dad jokes. I keep patient. Definitely seasonally in some states, New South Wales had a very good year this year. South Australia, not so much. One of the driest in over 120 years. Look, there's certainly an issue, and I think everyone in the regions knows that. It's just how we engage and mobilise people to allow the transition to progress at pace.
Cool. Is decarb the ultimate goal? Is that really what we should be aiming for?
Heck no. I love Mike's electrify everything. But what's brilliant is if we go to operating and focus just on stripping agriculture of emissions and having a zero profile, we're going to lose sight of what we're here to do and the real gift that we're giving the world with sustainable food and fibre every day that's high integrity and safe. And we feed Australia, we feed over 100 countries around the world. We can do both, and that really excites me.
Awesome. So the imperative for ag, that's high level, the role of decarb generally, but for ag, Gemma, something dawned on you in, I think it was 1991. What was that realisation and what was the trigger?
2019.
2019?
Well, I'd been very conscious of the climate movement and climate change for a long time. But what absolutely galvanised me as a person, despite a lot of work in climate change prior, was a late afternoon walk in January 2019 on my farm. It was still 43 degrees in the afternoon. And I walked through a wheat stubble and the earth was just pushing heat back up at me. And then I climbed over a fence into an area that we had zoned off for habitat. It had been locked up for probably about 8 years by that stage, and we had actively been trying to regenerate it. And the temperature drop at that fence line was physically 10 to 12 degrees. And on one side of the fence, Earth was trying to repair herself. And on the other side of the fence, we were doing our best to destroy it. And it just brought home to me that this is our monster. We built it. It's on us to fix it.
Great. Sean, what have your members seen? What have they reported? You do a lot of consultation with growers over a long period of time. They're connected to the land, and historically you're an avocado farmer at one point.
Amateur avocado farmer, yeah.
So what are they reporting?
Yeah, I mean, for us, Steve, we've got over 15,000 members nationally, and the bit that they struggle with most is obviously it's like anyone in society, family or friends, everyone's on a spectrum in terms of their beliefs and views, but being left out, I suppose, a bit to Nat's point. You know, if those that have children, or if you remember being a child being left out of a game or participation in something, it can be quite troubling. So I suppose in the transition to renewables, there's no doubt we need it to happen, but how do communities actually directly win from the transition? So just a quick analogy, and feel free to wrap me up as well because I tend to overspeak. But you know, back in the 1940s and 50s in regional Australia, electricity coming to your community was an absolute boon. You could have dialysis at your hospital, you could have refrigeration at home, you could have electric light and the wireless and school of the air as a result of electricity coming to town. I think that's something we need to peel the layers back a bit on in terms of how do we get 2 or 3 steps deeper for actual community benefits for transmission projects that actually bring jobs and bring back the vibrancy of our communities.
And what are the most burning issues that growers are facing? What are they really complaining about? And what are they knocking on your door to help lobby or move or shift the dial?
Yeah, look, I'm based in Canberra. I do a lot of the hand-to-hand, I wouldn't say combat, I'd say negotiation. And we don't care what colour the government is. We're an apolitical organisation. We're actually a charity. But cost of inputs has just ranked number 1 pretty much, or number 2 in our surveys and with our groups for years now. And look, just you touched on it before, but you know, growers will spend up to 20% of their income just on farm inputs, and we've been very much looking at, well, in this green transition, how can we actually make inputs on farm, cutting out the middle person and decentralising the model and taking back agency, because growers love agency and they're all about, you know, self-will and self-doing. So de-risking your supply chain, and driving down your costs, controlling your cost profile as well, a bit to sort of what the previous speaker was speaking about. So,
and you're an economist by background. You talk about input costs being the most significant challenge for farmers. How much do you have a sense of how much they've increased over the last 10 years and what they might do on that trajectory in the next 10 years? Yeah,
I mean, look, I'll talk specifically to urea. I'm sure that's a very familiar subject to those in agriculture. It's the number 1 provider of nitrogen on farm. And you know, that's gone from sort of $300-400 a tonne due to global gas policy. Urea is derived from natural gas mainly, and we don't make it here anymore in Australia, and we've seen up to $1,200 a tonne only a few seasons back, and that's moderated, but you know, we've seen 50, 60, 100% increases over the last few years in input costs, but I think that's not unique just to regions. Everyone's feeling it. Interest rates as well, just the environment we're in. So there's a desperate need to get back to energy security, but also have a competitive edge when it comes to farming globally to be able to stay in the game against our competitors in the Northern Hemisphere particularly.
Terrific. Natalie, I saw you nodding your head. I'm going to come to you in a moment, but Daniela, you're a techie. super techie, but you've got a background in soil ecology as well. Can't we just wait for technology to save the day?
I think there's definitely a role for technology, but the role for technology is to really be about supporting on-farm decisions and supporting transitions in this space. Look, I think in terms of decarbonisation, tech has a big role. You've probably saw yesterday, if you were around, some of the amazing tech that is actually contributing towards a decarbonised agriculture. But it's about how we take that tech and make sure that a producer sees that value proposition of using that tech, whether that be a productivity enhancement, a profitability aspect from that adoption of that tech, reduce costs of inputs. With the cost of inputs being so high at the moment, we really do need to sort of pull anything from our toolbox, and ag tech is definitely something I think in Australia we're quite strong with, and we should be relying on that a little bit more within looking at solutions for our decarbonisation.
And you're at the cutting edge of ag tech, looking to support the uptake of some new technology. What are the challenges you're facing in trying to get it out there, socialise it, and get that traction?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're finding quite difficult is around that value proposition to producers at the moment. And so there's a lot of mixed messages around what's actually required. So we're looking at greenhouse gas measurement in particular, and because there's no really strong market drivers for where this information's flowing to and how that's feeding into market incentives or access to additional markets, it's really hard to sell that value proposition to a farmer and say, well, you need to be measuring, when they don't know what value add that's actually going to produce. And so really it's around creating a consistent message to producers of what the value actually is, and to have these markets start to evolve. I'm not going to say too much around the economics because that's not my thing, and I'm sure Sean can sort of feed in on to some of that.
Yeah. I mean, look, for me, it's, we look back 20, I actually, to get my qualification in economics, my thesis was on carbon cap and trade versus tax, but happy to speak to that.
20 years ago, in fact.
Yeah, nearly 20 years ago. I'm showing my age now. But I think it's a wicked problem. We've got a wicked global problem, and I think with growers, it's very difficult for them to participate completely unless they're the direct winner of a infrastructure proposal or something, be it a wind farm or a solar farm on their property, without sort of that global cooperation, particularly from China and other countries in a larger system. So it's a very wicked problem indeed, and the market structures aren't there. We do have our ACCU system, which is a base anchor, but we don't have a global cap on emissions, which makes it difficult to price these issues.
So just on the imperative for ag, even if we reduced our emissions to net zero now, we're locked in for the next 10 years. Does it mean we hang up our hats, Natalie, or do we give up now?
I think, to put this in context, I'm not from the land. I'm a city slicker that knocked on the door of the National Farmers Federation during the millennial drought, just worried about what it meant for farmers, since it was illegal for me to wash my car or water my garden on the wrong day, and ended up finding a job and a career I fell in love with, and that was because I felt very values aligned to farmers, and I really respect them because they are can-do people. They're really collective. They care about not just getting to the end point, but the journey, so how it's done and the integrity that you operate with every day. And they're always thinking about the future and other people and operating in that holistic way. They don't compete with each other. It's the only sector I've ever been part of where that's the truth. And the reason I mention that is I don't think farmers have it in them to just get to somewhere and stop and turn off the engine. I also was nodding vigorously when other panellists were speaking, because farmers are really attracted to solving problems. They're really attracted to being better every day. One of the things we find that they love is the idea of being energy independent, doing a bit better by the land every single day, having, farmers know the bird life that's on their farm. They know the plantings, and they're always thinking and have ideas of what they want to do next. It could be succession planning as well. So I think it's not in the nature of anyone in agriculture to ever stop and pause and stand still. Aussie agriculture wouldn't be where we are today if that was in our nature. I do think, though, we've got a tendency to admire the problem, and it can get big really quickly. So I love people that focus on one thing at a time, and that's all we can do. Mike's given us some great examples. Gemma's talked about what spoke to her and what that leads to. So there are solutions everywhere, and I think the big trick is creating that certainty in the environment and leading by example, where we showcase solutions and put as much energy as we do on that than talking about what's difficult.
Could I make a comment?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Jump in.
I don't think Sean's wicked problem is at the farm level. I think the wicked problem is how we view the entire system and where farmers and how innovation sits in that system. As Australia is absolutely useless at considering big picture problems. We plonk renewable energy zones where we want with no consideration for, there's no big picture land use decisions being made, whether it be food, whether it be energy production, whether it be our water. As far as I can tell, there's no one at the top saying, how does this all work together for the benefit for all of us, for the benefit of the economy, for the benefit of the habitat, for the benefit of First Nations? We keep tackling our problems at this scale, and it's not working. It really isn't. We need to go up, out, and broaden our minds as to, sure, we fit in that big network, but we've got to really look at the entire picture. And Rewiring New Zealand is just so inspirational at that level.
So at Grong Grong, your farm, if we prevaricate, what are the implications for your farm?
Oh, farmers are we're on the coalface of climate change. It's abundantly clear. And farmers are absorbing technology as quickly as it arrives, using things like seed terminators, keeping as high possible stubble as possible, re-vegging, tree lines, anything that's available in the toolbox is what's being used. Where we've got perhaps large-scale corporate investment, the incentives are different. But I would argue that a mixed family farm is open to just about any technology that's going to improve how we deliver food into the market.
Daniela, you've got family farms in the Monaro region. Do you have a sense of what might be the implication for those farms if we don't act now?
I think it really comes back down to, if we don't act, we're going to see more extreme events, as we heard earlier today. And so that farm resilience piece is going to be more and more important if we don't act. And so those dual incomes and other mechanisms to be able to withstand those periods is going to be more important. And so I think that's really where the imperative is if we don't act, we will see more extreme events. We will see fluctuating economics. We will see our production go down and the profitability of our food and fibre systems go down with it. And
it's not will. We
We
are
are,
seeing.
exactly.
It's happening.
Yep. And we will see it more and more.
Absolutely.
So the frequency is going to
Closer,
increase.
higher.
Yep.
Yeah, droughts are definitely more intense. Our seasons are shortening. We can see that on farm, and it's having a very, very real impact. The problem is the problem is not evenly distributed, which is where government has a very strong role to play, in my opinion.
Sean, dollars are a driver in decarb, in infrastructure. Can farms prosper in a decarbonised world? You've done the modelling, you've done a whole lot of research papers around a whole lot of different technologies.
Absolutely, yeah.
Can they prosper?
I believe they can. And I think to the other gentleman's comments before, electricity is a very close runner to diesel at the moment. Even our own reports show that. So that's the inputs of the future report, just a free plug there, which was written by yours truly. But looking at the transition from off diesel to, say, potentially biofuel as a gap fill in the middle to electric versus hydrogen. We're not sure who's going to win that race. We see it as a mix. We're very much fuel agnostic, but coming from a trading background myself, I do see a lot of value in hedging your bets. So we're saying, for instance, we look at the mining industry. They've got equipment that is fuel agnostic. They can swap in hydrogen or electric or whatever it ends up being in the future, and that's going to come down to the economics. But we are seeing, for instance, the Future Made in Australia Fund, National Reconstruction Fund, the Hydrogen Head Start Fund, all very much a full court press towards hydrogen and other renewables and electrification. The problem is range, and that's what the reports point out is, obviously with a light vehicle, they're fantastic, electric light vehicle. Where you get into trouble at the moment is, trying to drive a grain header at 90% output for 3 days straight, obviously changing driver, with fatigue management, but that's a lot of load. So how do we solve the range issue with batteries especially? And then back to Nat's point that she made in her earlier address is how do we actually get the charging infrastructure in the region so they can have these things? So that's how we're really going to win, is by, I think it all comes back to including communities in the transition, getting access to that power that's coming through their farm or through their community to help them thrive.
So there's a light at the end of the tunnel, so that's really good news. Audience, if you want to challenge the speakers up here, please put it on Slido. I've got them here, so I'm happy to throw those questions in as well. Can I have the first slide, please, which you guys can see right here? And that's at up near Toowoomba, a big wind farm. So Natalie, I think you might have visited this, but it was part of the Renewables and Ag conference up there. So, and you mentioned this in your talk. So large-scale renewables, we're thinking wind farms, big solar farms, tend to benefit large energy companies, urban areas. So the offtake is shift away. How do we stop the benefits being diverted away? You said that we have to, but how do we stop it so that rapid decarbonisation doesn't harm the smaller farms?
So I think when we're looking at a transition to meet energy targets that we've set, and right now we're only 1% behind where we want to be, so we're able to be quickly back on track as a nation, which is exciting. One of the things we've got to realise is the market is not always going to be appropriate to judge for itself. So having signals that set a minimum standard of community benefit sharing, and also we believe in neighbour payments and a minimum standard of farmer payments as well. There is enough, what we've learnt since the first wind farm came to Australia over 20 years ago, is there is a huge amount of profitability in these large-scale energy developments. There is more than enough for everyone to win-win-win. And we think that that is absolutely critical. And what that means for farmers and regional Australians is actually really exciting.
Is that lobbying your local member? Is it standing up in front of earth movers? What's the approach? We're
not a fan of standing in front of earth movers. We don't think, we've seen lots of people do it, or big protests. We think a more contemporary approach is what's required. We're also willing and able to listen to the other side. On the 10th of September, we filled a room in the Queensland Parliament with over 200 people, sold that out in 2 weeks, and we had a whole lot of regional energy developers in the room, over 40 farmers, over 25 politicians. And what we did was actually talk about what's important and why we need to work together. And we walked out of that room with bipartisan support at a macro level. It's important to follow that up, and this is why I'm always asking for support and partnership, but if we're all asking for the same thing, it is there for the taking, and why wouldn't we? We're in Wagga, it's such a beautiful regional town. Imagine what these sort of investments could do for its future. We should go for that. A lot of these developers are doing great things, but a lot of them are owned multinationally as well.
Yep.
Let's preserve a fair amount of this wealth and prosperity in Australia.
Gemma,
mid-scale solar.
You use the words resource rape. They're strong words. What does that mean?
Well, large-scale investment to the benefit of someone who's not us. here in our region, often to no benefit in our region. So
How do we stop farmers being marginalised? What are you doing?
okay, we have a 1.5 megawatt mid-scale solar farm on our property. It's got the footprint of about a Bunnings car park. It generates enough energy for 700 homes. It's got a dual investment model, 175 plots of 3 kilowatts.
That's the Haystacks initiative, wasn't it?
The
The Trailblazing? Yep,
the
look it up.
Haystacks portion, which is solar garden. Just think in your mind about a community veggie garden where you haven't got a piece of soil of your own. So you walk down the block and there's a chunk of soil there, and you've bought that in order to harvest your veggies. That's how a solar garden works. You've bought a 3 kilowatt plot, and the kilowatts that are generated are struck off your energy bill in your rented apartment in Paddington. So the solar farm itself generates about enough energy for 700 homes. It is plugged into the poles and wires, the neighbourhood network. There's no additional public infrastructure being built. And at that size, at that scale, they should be as common as farm sheds, because it absolutely lifts the security of the grid. It's a secondary income for the host farm, just a kind of side hustle, if you like. No additional public infrastructure. We all know how the energy pool works, which is it is a pool. So in true fact, that green renewable energy being generated at my farm is probably being absorbed by Narendra in that sense. It just makes complete sense. The CEO of Essential Energy has come out and publicly said, now that we've measured the poles and wires network, not the transmission lines, just your neighbourhood network, has capacity for immediate capacity for an additional 10 gigawatt of power. So in terms of mid-scale solar on the poles and wires network to benefit communities locally, we can do it with political will today, now. We know what the problem is and we know what the solution is. What's going on in between?
So Gemma, she makes it sound easy. Gemma's no ordinary person. She rallied a community together to buy the local pub that was going out of business and would have otherwise not been there for the local community. You also organised for a whole lot of traditional Australians to come to Uluru, I think, to participate in The Voice. So, like, you are, like, how does everyone else participate, support that, the activities that you're doing, if they're not as proactive or not able to be as proactive as you?
Well, the actual solar garden, Haystack Solar Garden, received a New South Wales state government grant and then got tripped by an Abbott government taxation ruling that took a chunk of that grant before they even earmarked a piece of soil. But one of the caveats in that grant was that the process had to be published. The recipe, the findings, the difficulties, the obstacles and the wins had to be published in Commons and made freely available to everyone. The Community Power Energy, our developer Como and our retail partner Energy Locals are committed to this region now because having done what we've done, which has taken years, they've built an ecosystem of expertise in the Riverina. So we have lawyers, we have techs, we have big solar installers, we have concreters, we have pile drivers in the region who now know how to build the entire model.
Daniela, the tech's perspective, what opportunities are there for small tech to support these changes? But also, as an enabler, do you have a sense of what technology currently used will become stranded? So the stranded assets that it makes sense to build into your infrastructure renewal strategies early on so that we do build that buffer.
Look, I think in terms of tech, we can only use what's available to us at any one point in time. I think Mick talked about when he purchased EV vehicles and the cost for the car. There was a high cost, and now the EV vehicles are cheaper. I think we've just got to make those evidence-based decisions at the point of investment. And so whether that be for renewables or for transitions to other tech. I think the other piece that we're also missing in this decarbonisation conversation is we're talking a lot about energy and energy tech, but we're not focusing on, say, livestock and livestock tech and some of the simple things that we can do, those low-hanging cherries, as Mick put it, that we can use now that can actually take us one step towards decarbonisation. We're missing that elephant in the room. We haven't talked about it yet around methane. And so things to address methane, what are the small steps that we could do to reduce livestock methane? Simple things like looking at our herd efficiencies, looking at things like our reproduction rates within livestock, looking at turn-off times, getting to weight quicker on a smaller animal will reduce emissions. But we're focused so much on this decarbonisation story rather than focusing on the productivity and profitability gains that we can get by making some on-farm decisions that are quite simple, those low-hanging cherries that we can approach. So we've got tech currently in the market. Optiway is a great example of some tech that has a really great value proposition to a producer. You can tell your animal weights in field so you know exactly what's happening. Animal health perspective, you can make those decisions quicker and earlier, and then you can ultimately reduce your emission profile. And so it's simple things like that that I think we often forget when we're having these big discussions about decarbonising ag. We go straight to the big renewables, we go straight to the big solutions, but we forget about all of those smaller solutions that we can use
And I think that's partly because we're not so worried about it because the uptake's so strong. You know, there are all these inputs, including, feed additives being tested, but a lot of things being utilised at the moment in almost by every livestock producers using things
I think I'd debate that a little bit, Natalie. I think in terms of the uptake of ag tech, I think we're actually quite poor. The uptake of ag tech's actually really low. In terms of supplements and feed additives to reduce methane, we know that there's a whole heap of things available, but you go and tell a producer that you need to spend, say, upwards of $1 a day per head, and they automatically go to their books and say, well, what am I getting in return? Where is my profitability in this situation? I can't even measure my methane emissions at the moment without having to go to a university or a research setting. So what is the value proposition to a producer? So there's very little value proposition at the moment, and that's I think affecting that adoption. And so
I think there's what I should have said is there's more research happening now for different farm sizes, usages, amounts, and results that farmers are keenly watching. We can't put on enough webinars about that sort of work at the moment, and we get the highest uptake on these sorts of things.
I might just add that Australians, I think the last figure I saw, we use 43 million litres of fuel a day. And methane is a really useful problem for the fossil fuel industry to trot out as a big problem. But at 43 million litres of fossil fuel a day being consumed, how big a problem? Like, I know methane's a problem, but how big a problem is it?
And so I think that for livestock, for agriculture, it's actually our biggest emission source. And so this is when the equity thing comes into it as well. So methane emission from livestock is very different to methane emission from mining or other sectors. And because they're not treated, or at the moment, they're treated as the same. And so we're being already put at a disadvantage. And we're not on an even playing field to start off with.
Is completely wrong.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to suggest that you're missing, while we're talking a systems approach, that you're missing one of the biggest problems, and that's people. So we're fickle. Can I have the other slide, please. Can you step back and have a look at that, panellists? That's not your farm, though, is it, Gemma?
Nope.
So what thoughts does that image trigger in you?
First thought is really poor communication.
By who? By them? They're committing.
Oh, no.
This is down the road. This is on the way here.
We're in the Riverina. Darlington Point, there's a solar farm for as far as the eye can see. Now, there are several arguments going on. One is you're taking productive farmland. As a farmer, I don't feel like I have the moral high ground to say who owns the farm and who runs the farm, because I feel as though we're all sitting on stolen or borrowed land, and we have a stewardship role rather than an ownership role. I'm not a big fan of endless large-scale solar, and I really empathise with the farms and the farm communities that have very little say, very little input and very little benefit to what's going on well out of sight of the cities. And that includes people who are newly hosting large-scale transmission lines. Because we've all heard the line, you know, what is it? Without transmission, there's no transition. It's a big, difficult pill to swallow, and it's being imposed on people, you know?
And this is a
The
symptom.
work has not been done.
This is a symptom of communities not being consulted.
Absolutely.
There's a sense, and I've raised this in rooms where there's developers, and I showed a photo which I shared with you, Stephen, of in July, my former workplace, the Clean Energy Council, invested a huge amount of money in wraparounds around the Murdoch newspapers, so the Courier Mail, the Herald Sun, and so on and so forth. And it said an image of a wind farm and a wind farm worker, and it says, "You're welcome." You know, Australia's got 40% renewables in our grid. And that's a great outcome, but it's also, that whole message was just so off to us, and we got a lot of phone calls. We watch and speak to every single farmer we see that's concerned about renewables. Between mid-January and mid-March, we called proactively 500 farmers, a lot of them not FCA members.
What about the ones that don't care? Do you speak to them as well?
Well, we proactively called them. We got their names from other farmers or people in the media or Facebook who are just really anti-renewables, because we wanted to understand why, wanted to see what's the issue, can we help solve it with you, because we care about them just as much as we care about our members. Most of them actually, there was a sense of just losing control of your community, of feeling not respected or consulted in the process. Communities have different priorities. Only 8 of them were willing to speak, to join us on a virtual roundtable with the then Minister for Agriculture, Murray Watt, to talk about the issues. Most actually didn't want to publicly say anything, or when they talked about it, they said, "Look, I don't know what it is exactly, it just feels out of control, and someone's got to stand up and speak because it's happening without our voice being included."
Absolutely.
So we're standing up with some other partners, a lived experience panel. The first one will be in Dubbo, chaired by our former chair, Charlie Prell, and other farmers, basically talking about what communities want and need. Really, our objective is to encourage community co-design at the start of the process, recognising the horse has bolted, so we're not starting from a greenfield, but we've got to start somewhere to be part of that discourse and solution. So we're optimistic. We'd love your support on helping these things take flight, but we need to talk to decision makers, but we need to listen to communities and have them involved in decisions that they will be living with for the next 30 years and then some.
Great. We've only got a couple of minutes, but there's a couple of things I want to touch on because I think this is really valuable. You've mentioned transition, but Natalie, you said you can't use that word.
Yeah, well, our farmers don't like it. For them, it represents the people that come and impose something on your community. It implies that you're being forced to change, and that says you were part of the problem. So we use the word energy shift because it's a shift. Farmers are always in a state of change. So what we've learnt, and this is polling over almost 10 years, and sentiment research, if we say energy shift, it feels like we're all shifting together. Transition just feels hijacked, is the feedback we get.
And farmers are not against, on this opinion, farmers are not against renewables. Farmers absolutely understand the technology. There are panels on farm sheds all over the Riverina. It's the process of the transition that has got people up in arms. It's the way it's been rolled out at speed, out of their control, over their heads, and consultation isn't just a day in the community hall. You know, it's deep, it's meaningful, and it takes years.
Sean, you recognise the value of using the right language, the right terminology. In fact, you use the term carbon curious conversations. Why have you adopted that?
Yeah, look, an initiative that Grain Growers has rolled out, Steve, is Carbon Curious workshops. I can't take credit for that. Our CEO and fantastic team executed those, but it's creating carbon literacy. And I think growers, to your point, Gemma, embrace in the majority, embrace renewables, and they're genuinely good people. You know, they want to do the right thing. But I think literacy, probably less than 5% of all Australian grain growers would know their carbon number and be able to do accounting on that. And I think the road we're heading down, you know, with whatever government looks like, whatever colour of government is, there's going to be a continued push towards more accountability, especially with the first shoe to drop will be the banks. It'll be, hello, Mr. X, Mrs. XY, your interest rate is going to be higher or lower based on your ESG credentials. And I think that's going to be coming very soon. And I think preparedness is really where we're at. The transition, I was going to make some comments about that, but I think Gemma's, it's obviously her area of expertise.
I'm so grumpy.
Yeah, oh no, I think they're good comments. But I think, once again, for growers, they're not selfish people. They're very service-orientated, volunteer mindset. They love their communities. And I think we need to, Natalie's language and your comment around language, we need to talk about how this is a regional revival, not a divide or even an apartheid. You've got second-class citizens. We need to all participate, and I think that's how we will all win. To be honest, we have to sell that proposition as strong as it was back in the day, with you having a dialysis machine in your town, or your children will have better health and educational outcomes. It's got to come back to something real for farming families and communities.
Thank you. Quickly, Daniela, you're an advocate for science communication. Any thoughts on the word transition and climate curious or carbon curious?
I love the climate curious. It moves away from carbon coma that I feel like so many of the producers have suffered. And I think it's really about that clarity of information. It's that consistent story, that consistent messaging around why we should be doing this and what the value is to you. Yeah.
The benefit.
Production, productivity. Let's go back and take it back down to the things that are really important, which is that productivity and sustainability all in one. And so if we take it back, we can remove that carbon coma and I think start to actually have some good conversations around that.
Great. And to close, a couple of words. What mindsets do we need to adopt going forward?
Open-mindedness. So therefore, I invite everyone to tell me what I've missed. We've got all day. We don't have a long time to get this right. So I welcome feedback so we can improve and do our job on behalf of farmers.
Gemma, what do you think?
Oh, if you have a farm near a 22 kVA line, let me know, because I've got developers who want to talk to you about mid-scale solar.
But what mindset do they need to adopt to be able to embrace that sort of approach? Openness?
We're all in this together. It's no singular problem. The cows are not the problem. It's we're in it together. It's Anzacs all over again. You know,
Openness, togetherness, that solidarity.
we can't solve this in silos.
Sean, any thoughts on mindsets?
Yeah, look, I think just looking at the wicked problem, both globally, locally, we're going to need a lot of shots on goal. So I think people need to remain open-minded about what it looks like. And, how do we sell this as a regional, rural renaissance rather than separation between us and our people, our cohorts in the cities. We're all in it together. We all benefit together from this if we do it correctly.
Regional renaissance, you heard that here. Daniela, passing thoughts.
Collaborative. So we can't do this in silos. We need to do this collaboratively and together.
Excellent, great. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, audience.
Thank you.